Grazie alla professoressa Goethen. E adesso l'ultimo dei nostri esperti, il professor Jose Tarazona, responsabile dell'unità per gli antiparassitari presso la European Food Safety Authority di Parma. Prego, anche a lei 15 minuti. Grazie.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, honorable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here to present the scientific process behind the EU assessment of glyphosate. It's clear that our process is a regulatory process. It's part of a regulation, Regulation 1107, that was approved by this Parliament and the Council in October 2009. It has two main purposes. First, to ensure a high level of safety for human health and for the environment. And second, to provide the farmers in the EU with the tools that they need in order to protect the crops and produce safe food. The regulatory process also clarifies what are the roles of the different actors. The process starts with the companies, with the industry that wants to market pesticides in the EU. We call them the producer or the applicant. Then we have a member state that acts as the rapporteur that organizes the first check of the application from the company, and then we in EFSA organize the peer review of the assessment by the rapporteur member states, including consultation with member states, going back to the applicant when needed, and also having a public consultation to involve the public and any other stakeholder. Let's start with the process. The process starts with the legislative frame. In order to ensure a high level of protection, all the pesticides, so the companies need to present a proposal for approval and application for approval of the active substance, and later on, the assessment of the formulation by the member states. And the safety of the European citizens and the European environment is guaranteed by the renewal process. So every 10 years, 15 years, depending on the chemical, the companies need to go back and present again a new dossier containing all the information. It's important to mention that the applicant, in the case of glyphosate, is not just Monsanto. We are talking about 24 different companies, and we have studies conducted and sponsored by these 24 different companies in the case of glyphosate. The companies need to present the application and the dossier. It's a big dossier. It's an electronic file, but if somebody tried to print out, we are talking about several hundreds of thousands of pages. And the companies cannot choose. The companies must go to the regulation. There is a specific information on the data requirements, and the information on the data requirements is sufficient to evaluate the risk for human health, animal health, and the environment. And this applies to all the pesticides. And you can see that a large number of pesticides have been classified as carcinogenic, as genotoxic, as toxic for reproduction, toxic for the environment, based exactly on the same data requirements. I will say there is a huge amount of information. It's the information that is not comparable to any other chemicals in the EU, and I think that is a quite comprehensive assessment, covering everything, not just carcinogenicity. This evidence, the dossier, contains two sets of studies. First, mandatory studies that must be sponsored by the companies, conducted according to international guidelines, so the companies cannot decide the methodology. They must follow the methodology that has been agreed by the experts beforehand, and must be done under good laboratory practice. And also a review of a scientific open literature. And any relevant information from the open scientific literature will be incorporated into the assessment. But it's not only the studies. The applicant must demonstrate the safe use, at least one safe use for a big crop, a crop that is widely grown in the EU, and when the active substance is used at least in one protection product. But even more important, the European regulation required the dossier and the applicant to provide also the full reports of the study. This allows us in EFSA, as well as the experts in the member states, to go back to the original study, to go back to the raw data, and to check every single piece of the application. It's clear in the legislation that when the applicants submit the dossier, they can claim some part of the dossier to be considered as confidential. And let's move to the assessment by the rapporteur member state. The rapporteur member state, that was Germany in the case of glyphosate, is not conducting an independent assessment of something from the literature. It's assessing the application that has been submitted by the companies. The rapporteur member state has access to all the studies, to the full study reports, go back to the assessment, and can check if the summaries and the assessments that are presented by the applicant are correct. If the rapporteur member state is able to verify that the information is correct, the information is moved to the assessment by the rapporteur member state, and if the rapporteur member state considers that there are errors, the errors are correct, and obviously if the assessment, if the rapporteur member state does not agree with the assessment by the industry, the rapporteur member state include their own assessment. There has been a lot of allegations of copy and paste, of plagiarism by people that do not understand the process. The rapporteur member state assesses the application that has been presented by industry. And if they are checking the application, the rapporteur verify that the information is correct, obviously that information is included in the rapporteur member state assessment. And the reason is that we want a single document, the rapporteur member state assessment, that produces comprehensive, covering all the areas of the risk assessment for human health, animal health, and the environment, and that includes the view of the rapporteur member state, independently if the views are the same or are not the same with the views from the applicant. Obviously, the key differences are highlighted, and you can go to the documents to confirm this assessment. For every single study that is considered relevant, you can see in the background document the summary of the study that has been verified and checked and modified by the rapporteur member state if needed, the conclusion by industry. In this case, from that study, industry concluded that the study was sufficient to say that glyphosate is not carcinogenic in rats, but the rapporteur, and also you can see the comment from the rapporteur member state saying, sorry, industry, this is a study sponsored by industry. It's a study conducted by OECD guidelines and GLP, but nevertheless was checked by the rapporteur member state that this particular study is not acceptable. We have no sufficient information on the identity of the substance. We have a lot of the deficiencies in the methodology, so the study is not valid. And that is done for every single study in all the areas, from human health and efficacy to the environmental assessment by the rapporteur member state. And the next step is the peer review. Is the step conducted by EFSA in cooperation with other member states. Peer review is a review by peers of the assessment, and that is the basic principle in science. All scientific publications are called peer review publications because it's the process that is used currently in science. The process starts with the submission of the assessment by the rapporteur member state. We start the process of consultation with the peers in EFSA and the member states, and also we always have a public consultation. For glyphosate, the public consultation was launched in 2014, and between 2014 and 2015, we organized the expert group. The assessment is done by independent experts from public bodies, experts that are scientists that are directly working with us in EFSA in Parma, as well as more than 70 experts from EU member state risk assessment public organizations, including all EU member states and Norway. And there has been a lot of talk about transparency. It's important to mention that if you go to the background documents, you will see every single comment that has been submitted during the EFSA assessment and how every single comment has been addressed. In our view, that is a very clear indication of the transparency of the process. Obviously, the meeting minutes of every single expert meeting are published as well. And one of the key elements of the EU process that ensure the high level of protection for human health and the environment is that the experts in EFSA as well as in the other member states have also access to the raw data, to the original study reports, and obviously check, and you can verify in the EFSA document that this is the case. This is the first assessment, the initial assessment by Germany of a particular study. And you can see in the background document, highlighted in yellow, the assessment and the modifications following the EFSA peer review. You see that some of the elements were accepted by the experts, other parts not, and you see the deletion of some elements, additional modifications. And if you go to the document, like in this case, you will see that even numbers of the doses was changed. That obviously confirmed that the experts in EFSA, as well as in the member states, go back to the original studies and check every single relevant study for the, in their assessment and peer review of the German report. And it's not only on study by study, it's also on the main conclusion. Again, in the original proposal, Germany considered that there was no need for setting an acute reference dose. And that is a very good example as well. In yellow, you can see the indication after the peer review. You can see, if you read the elements, that the experts go back to the original studies, identify particular effects that were not highlighted by the rapporteur member state in 2 studies on rabbits, and based on that, conclude that there was a need to have an acute reference dose that was at 0.5 milligrams kilogram body weight. It's important for those that are not familiar with the system to recognize that by setting an acute reference dose, we are putting a lot of additional complexity for the companies to market the some uses, because that increases significantly the protection for the consumers. After the peer review, we publish our conclusion. The conclusion is based on the assessment of the rapporteur member state that, as I have already mentioned, is based on the assessment by the applicant and cover all the areas of the assessment. For carcinogenicity, you already know that in our conclusion, based on a huge amount of available evidence, we conclude that there is no carcinogenicity potential and that glyphosate, the active substance glyphosate, do not require classification for carcinogenicity. By the way, it's important to mention that all regulatory agencies following us in Canada, Japan, New Zealand has confirmed this. The same for the World Health Organization group of pesticides, GMPR, and finally ECHA, the Committee for Risk Assessment of the European Chemicals Agency. With this in the EU, the bodies having the final word on harmonized classification has also confirmed that there is no need to classify glyphosate for carcinogenicity. There has been also a lot of claims that we have our assessment based exclusively on industry-sponsored study. And you see the evidence that is clearly not true. If you read our conclusion, you will see that we have identified a possible genotoxicity for the formulations. It's not related to glyphosate. It's related to other chemicals that in some formulations are included. And this particular conclusion is based on studies from the public literature. So it's clear that we have used, and there is evidence in our background document that we have used the literature search. Also, there has been claims that our assessment is very good for the companies or very kind with the companies. Sorry. We have been the first organization setting an acute reference dose. And as I mentioned before, setting an acute reference dose creates significant elements because increase the protection of the consumers and create significant elements for the authorization of particular uses by the companies. And if you are familiar with the system, will immediately recognize that setting an acute reference dose may create more concern for the company that, for example, classification as carcinogen category 2. And also there are claims saying that we have not covered other areas. Sorry, please read the conclusion. We have identified risks for farmers and the environment, but risks that can be mitigated, and we are clearly recommended the member states in their assessment to consider very carefully those elements and to ensure that the risk for farmers and the risk for the environments are covered in the authorizations. Glyphosate is a broad-spectrum herbicide. If you read our conclusion, you will see that there are risks for wild plants, as for many other herbicides, but risks that can be controlled by adequate measures that should be taken by the member states in the authorization. In summary, what you have from EFSA and the EU assessment, again, is EFSA scientists plus a large amount of experts in the member states, an EU assessment of glyphosate that was carried out according to the legal framework decided by this Parliament and the Council, and it's the same that is used for all the pesticides in the EU. Is the assessment of the active substance, because that is very clear in the regulation. EFSA is involved in the process for the approval of the active substance, is not involved in the process for the authorization of the products. It's the responsibility of the member states to assess each formulated product and each intended use, and for that, it's important that the member states focus on the EFSA conclusion and what we call the list of endpoints that should be used in the risk assessment by the member states. The assessment is based on a comprehensive body of evidence. We have assessed in total over 1,500 studies, 700 studies only in the area of toxicology, so a huge amount of information. And also, it's an independent process that involves expert scientists that are employed by EFSA as well as by the member states, that is include a consultation with the general public that allow the public to submit information, and is very transparently reported. Every single conclusion, every single minute, every modification of the assessment is presented in the 6,000 pages of background documents that EFSA has been published. Thank you very much.
Bene, grazie anche al nostro terzo esperto, il professor Jose Tarazona dell'EFSA, e adesso diamo inizio alla domanda e risposta dei nostri deputati. Ricordo che darò 1 minuto a ciascun collega e vi prego di indicare il nome dell'esperto a cui rivolgete la domanda. Iniziamo subito e do la parola a Pilar Ayuso.